So thanks for being here, everyone. Today it will be our first special seminar of fall quarter, and this will be the first remote seminar actually for the academic year. And so we are grateful to have Mahtash, Stephanie, and Samuel from our department to talk about how to effectively teach an applied statistics course and how to do effective remote teaching. So we think it will be very helpful for all of us, including faculty and TAs. So maybe Mahtash and Stephanie or Samuel, you can go first and share your screen about the talk.
Okay, I will share my screen.
Okay.
Stephanie is taking the lead of showing the screen. Okay. I guess I'm gonna, how can I make this full screen? Okay, that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I don't think I can make it any bigger.
Okay, so what we wanted to talk about here is that Stephanie and I taught two sections of the consulting course in winter and spring of last year. And then Sam taught the consulting course after the pandemic. And Sam and I also taught the 101A Introduction to Linear Model in the summer. And we're going to be talking about the results we got pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and you know, telling you what, how we went about and what did we do. So next slide. So the objectives of this presentation is that, first of all, we are going to elaborate a theoretical model that underlies the teaching of applied statistics. And this model actually emphasizes a lot of the stuff that people in SEALs have been talking about. Then I'll go over objectives of each course. Then I'll talk about teaching and learning strategies that we use to get to our goals, and then what assessment techniques we used, and data we collected to show that the course worked or didn't work. And Steph and Sam are going to give you sample projects from those classes. And then finally, we'll talk about results, conclusions, and recommendations. So the first, I'm going to be talking about the theoretical model which underlies the teaching of the courses we are going to describe. Next slide, please. So this theoretical model, this theoretical framework is based on the work of Merlin Wittrock. He's a very well-known cognitive scientist and was a professor at the School of Education, very well-known in the world. And I did work with him on a couple of projects, and he also came as a guest speaker for Stat Education when we started the 370 seminar. So that's where the learning part is based on his theory. And then the two other dimensions that I have added are hard and soft skills, and then statistical literacy. So the model, next slide, please, is based on these three dimensions that you see here: cognitive theory, hard and soft skills, as well as statistical literacy. So this is the basis of our work, and our teaching is basically based on all these different dimensions. And I think it's important that we have a theory behind whatever we're gonna talk about. So I'm not gonna go over everything that's in this, because you know everything that's in this schematic, because we'll talk about exactly all these different dimensions as we go through. Next, please. Now I want to describe the objectives of the course. Basically, oh, Stephanie, I think you need to go a couple of slides. One more. Okay. So we want to talk about the objective of a statistical consulting course that was taught in person pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. This is our 141 SL and 140. So what happens in the first course, they learn data management, visualization, manipulation. Professor Liu teaches that course. And when they come to 141, in 140, they also talk about communication skills. in 141, we talk about statistical ethics of statistical consulting. Actually, they analyze cases, find dilemmas, and tell me what's wrong. They write their own cases. And then we have speakers we have speakers in this class. They are statisticians, they are people from industry, they are previous students. And so we have guest speakers, 3 or 4 guest speakers. And students work as a group and they write what we call reflection papers about what they learned from these people. And that's another part of the course. And then we closely have been working with the UCLA community and the community at large to help them conduct data analysis. And then at the very end, you know, we give them a presentation as well as final report and, you know, interpretation of data within context. And, you know, this collaboration has been very successful. We've done it with medical school, with, you know, on campus and so on. Next slide. Okay, then the objectives of the linear model, which is our 101A class, the first thing that we do is that we make sure that they have the prior knowledge and, you know, of math and so on, about model fitting, regression, and so on. Then we have them practice communication skills by writing the data for a statistical, non-statistical audience. And we help them answer real world questions using, you know, on a project using the methods they learned. So basically you can see it's true, one is a consulting course and the other one is a course on linear models, but the structure is very similar. The only thing is that in 101A, they don't have a real client. So we become like their client, the TA and the instructor. Next slide, please. Explaining next week, I'm going to be talking about the teaching and learning strategies that have been implemented in these classes. Next slide. So the first thing that is very, very important is the clear statement of the objective, which guides the students. They know by looking at that objective, they know how they'll be evaluated. The other important thing is that you make sure that you create a mutually respectful learning environment for the students to feel comfortable asking questions, social concern for students, and exhibiting, having enthusiasm about what you're teaching. So these are all the cognitive aspect of the model. Next slide, please. And then here, there is capturing the student's attention. So there's short-term question when you attract or distract them. There is long-term attention where you give them something that's discrepant and, you know, they've got to build meaningful relationships between them. And voluntary attention, asking questions that entice them. Next, please. One of the very important things is that the students have to understand that their success is related to effort, and they've got to take responsibility for their own learning, and then success follows. We had one of, in the meeting yesterday with incoming students, we had one of the old alumni, and somebody asked him, what did you take with you that helped you? He said, what I took with me was that I knew that I had to do my own learning and, you know, checking Google where I work and so on. So this is something that we make sure that the students, you know, gets to them. Next, please. Okay, this theoretical model that you see here is the work of Osborne and Wittrock. And it completely explains what happens when knowledge gets generated. So there is something here called a memory store where all the prior information is here. Then what we are doing with catching attention is what we call sensory input. And the sensory input, it depends what you are using. For us, it was review quizzes that they take online, not graded, as many times as they want. Lectures, articles, exercises, homeworks, projects, exam, whatever. So when this happens, then a message, then what happens, the student goes to their memory store and they select some kind of information. So this attracts their attention. Then they get out of the memory store some information. Then what happens, that information, then there is a link that gets generated between the new information they're getting and whatever old information that is in the memory store. And then this multidimensional process happens and happens over and over again in between here going to the memory and then creating more ties and more ties. Then as a result, new knowledge gets absorbed. And then once it gets absorbed and they make all those connections, then it goes back into the memory store. So the whole thing about this model is that you want to make sure that all the students have the same prior knowledge, and you want to make sure the kinds of questions that you're asking students, that they are going back to their prior knowledge and they're making connections to the new knowledge. And that's why the nature of the questions asked from the students is very important, both during lecture or section or exercise or whatnot. So this shows exactly the process of active learning and generative knowledge in this plot. Next, please. Okay. I talked about this, taking ungrade quizzes. What has really worked in our classes is what I call CFU, checking for understanding. And it really worked during this pandemic. Let's say I teach 3 or 4 concepts. Then I create an exercise that is testing for those 3 concepts. So I stop, they go back in their groups, they start working on these CFU exercises. Then Sam and I, or Stephanie and I, would check upon them from group to group and see how they're doing. And then later, as soon as the lecture is over, I post the answers. These CFUs have been rated the highest part of the course by whatever class that we have taught. And one of the things that we did was that we kept the same groups all quarter. And when we divided them into groups through Zoom, most of the time we did not do random grouping. So the same people would be working on CFUs together and, on the presentation and so on. Next, please. So I already talked about that. Next. Okay, hard skills. What are hard skills? Hard skills are the math you learn, the knowledge of statistics you learn, the programming, visualization, data management, etc., etc. Soft skills are something that you can actually go give a lecture on. This is something that happens as a result of collaboration between teams. And as a result of that, people learn to be flexible, think out of the box, be realistic, do right time management, deal with setbacks, prioritize, etc., etc. And this happens all through the process of, working on whatever you're working and on a project or whatever. And I know that one of the students I brought back to talk to the class 141, he said, well, if you don't know Python, we can teach you, but we can't teach you how to communicate orally and verbally. And that's the type of people we're looking for when we want to hire somebody. But the students don't see the importance of that because it's not an immediate need. But this is something that we're big on. Next slide, please. Okay, statistical literacy, we've all heard a lot about. It's one of the major, points of guys, and we emphasize that through, learning how to write and how to verbally express the statistical findings. And they practice, by looking at journal articles, by analyzing journal articles, the research and so on. Next, please. Okay, what we did is that in the first 5 weeks, we divided students into teams that did homework, and so on. As soon as the second 5 weeks was there, we created different teams. And those teams, based on the input that Professor Lu would give me, I would know which team is better for what project. So the people in the second 5 weeks in the consulting class are different from the group of people in the first 5 weeks. But in Stat 101, we kept the same teams all quarter. Next, please. Describing the strategies for student assessment. That's what I'm going to be talking now. There is a take-home midterm that asks for the math as well as statistical techniques, and it's like also little data analysis project. And so in pre-COVID, we had a lot of clients that work with different groups. Post-COVID or post-pandemic, all of the projects were about COVID. Next, please. Strategies implemented for assessing students is that in the statistical consulting work, they had to report on 3 milestones, and this was really good. First, they had to tell us what is the data, what's their code book, what question they want to answer. Second milestone, EDA, progress report. Last milestone, presentation of results. And Sam and I were present in the progress reports too, and each group was supposed to tell us where they are and what they're doing. And that was they found that very helpful. Next, please. Strategies for assessing students. We had also a final report, and the final product was supposed to be a report, a code book, clean data, R codes. And we always give that information to the client, and they appreciate it. Next, please. What is important I want to bring into your consideration is that sometimes when, you know, the first theoretical model we showed you with a bunch of compartments on statistical literacy and that one, we don't want to create the impression that these are all separate entities or separate schemas. No, there is a major overlap on all these 3 components. And in teaching, students will be working on all this stuff simultaneously. Like, for example, in the COVID-19, teams of students were required to learn the epidemiology behind SARS-2, as well as what mathematical model to use to predict the, virus's behavior. So we had people come actually speak to them about the epidemiology of things. They read scientific articles about the behavior of SARS. Then they went out, got their own data. Then they did the project. So all this idea about, creation of knowledge and soft and hard skills and statistical literacy, they're happening all year round. But it's not that one is happening, one it's not, one is happening, one it's not. So I just don't want to create this illusion that, those compartments are all separate from each other. Next, please. You went back to the beginning, Steph. Oh, so, okay, no, right. How did we evaluate the course? That's what I wanted to talk about. So the theoretical underpinning of the model, there is a lot of theory behind that. So I created a Likert scale type of survey to see how students felt about the different part. They were also asked to answer a number of open-ended questions. An example would be, if you wanted to explain this course in 5 words, what would they be? What were your most, what were your most valuable experiences? What can we, improve in this course? Next, please.
Okay.
So now I'm going to turn it to Stephanie, who's going to be talking about sample projects from pre-pandemic in the consulting course.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so Sam and I will introduce a couple of the projects that we have sort of worked with students on during being TAs, and specifically how those projects have really aligned with sort of the 3 points or the 3 strategies for teaching and learning that we've been talking about. So I have TA'd with Mahtash for 2 quarters. Both of those quarters were for the statistical consulting class. So these examples that I'm going to share with you are both from that course. And the first one is about crowdsourcing eyelid contour quantification. Okay, so this was with the Jules Stein Eye Institute, and we worked with Dr. Daniel Rootman, who's an eye surgeon there. And here's what the data look like. So we had these images of eyes, and they asked people to essentially draw the upper eyelid contour for those images. And here on the right, you can see is an aggregation of a whole bunch of non-experts or laymen who are drawing this eyelid. And then they also had, in addition to the non-experts, they had an expert who will do the same drawing. And so we have this set of like XY points for a whole bunch of different eyes and rated by a whole bunch of different people. And so what the client really wanted to understand was, well, okay, so we could get an expert to draw this contour, but that's sort of expensive and time consuming for them. So could we somehow push this problem to laymen and recruit them and still get that accurate quantification? Okay, so from this sort of problem setup, I want to go back to those like 3 strategies that we've been talking about. And so the first is the application of cognitive theory, right? And so for the students to solve this problem, they needed to both draw from like the old existing knowledge they have that maybe they've learned in a previous course, as well as sort of be flexible about coming up with new ideas and new ways to problem solve. And I'll explain a little bit more in detail how these strategies are done in the next couple slides. So on the right, you can see our problem statement. How can we recruit laymen to get an accurate quantification of the upper eyelid contour? And so one of the tenets of the cognitive theory has to do with problem solving. And I think this is especially important for consulting when you're working with a client. And essentially that would mean that, you know, your client has this idea of what they want and this set of knowledge and expertise in their area. But what they want and what they're interested in might not be the same as what you can do as a statistician and how you can quantify that problem in a very statistical way to answer what they're actually looking for. And so for the students, this becomes first like a translation kind of problem. So how do we make something that they want into sort of well-defined questions that we can answer with statistics? And so they were able to break down this question into essentially 3 pieces. And the first is, how can we quantitatively model these eyelid contours? The second is, how can we compare expert data to layman data? And that'll give us a notion of accuracy. And the third, and possibly like the end goal of what they were really interested in, is how many laymen do you need to recruit for an accurate enough fit? So this is really like the cognitive theory side of it and how they started to think about this problem. And so the second dimension is this skill acquisition, so hard and soft skills, right? And a lot of that has to do with like, how do you interact with the data? So what they did was they actually went ahead and did a lot of pre-processing. So they came up with this outlier removal pipeline, essentially, and said, well, you know, you can see that the data that we're getting from laymen is actually quite messy. Like here in the top image, you see a lot of people are also drawing the lower eyelid, even though they're only asked to draw the upper eyelid. And there are just some people who draw points everywhere. So can we come up with some systematic way that is just based on the data to help clean that and remove some of the outliers and get sort of a better fit before we even attempt to make that fit? And so they did a lot of work in coming up with like a set of criteria in order to make this data better and cleaner, so that when they actually were able to make a recommendation about the number of laymen that they wanted to recruit, it could be smaller because they could take that data, the messy data from the laymen, and process it in a very streamlined way. And so another aspect of this was sort of data visualization, right? And they provided the client with a lot of different ways to view how they were fitting the data, as well as how the results should be interpreted in a very like visual manner and not just talking about it, overwhelming people with numbers or tables. And of course, I guess the core of it is what kinds of statistical methods they were using in order to solve this problem. And so before, in the cognitive theory slide, I introduced 3 subproblems that they broke the main problem down into. And here are sort of the 3 solutions that they are using to solve those subproblems. So the first is, how do you quantify the eyelid? And they looked at a variety of different model fitting types, including polynomial and Loess, and compared those on different images. And then accuracy, so they used this like mean squared error metric using the expert data that they have as sort of this golden standard, and looking at the difference between that and how the model fits are doing, as well as how many laymen do you need. And so for this, they had to be a little bit more creative and do something that perhaps that they weren't as familiar with, and come up with this like novel resampling technique to estimate for different sizes of samples how accurate those fits would be and how many people that they would want based off of that criteria. So the final dimension of this is statistical literacy, and that has to do with communication and how you really talk to non-statistical people and specifically hear your clients. And so this team was able to give a good presentation at the end of the 5 weeks and really give like clinically meaningful interpretations to the clients, as well as actual statistically backed recommendations. So the question was, how many laymen do we need? And they were able to say, well, given that you want to reach some sort of accuracy threshold, we can estimate the minimum number of people you would need to recruit for an accurate estimation of that upper eyelid. So if you think about this, right, it's a lot going on, and it's really amazing that in such a short time, in only 5 weeks, like students are able to get so much from it. And it's a really creative process, and I think each project looks a little bit different. So it's cool to work with them and see that product at the end. So the second project that I want to talk a little bit more briefly about is course combination toxicity. So we worked with Dr. Adam Sagano and Cecilia Zhang from the Academic Planning and Budget Management Department. And what they had was a whole bunch of course records from students, including some de-identified, of course, sort of like background information about the students, as well as their standardized GPA. So for a particular course, how was your GPA relative to the class average GPA? And so what they were interested in learning was, how can we identify toxic course combinations, right? So if you take that course alone, maybe you'll do much better than if you take that course in conjunction with this other course. And so they want to know, based on that, like how they can help build course plans and recommend, well, like maybe if you're concerned, you should try and plan out taking courses in separate quarters instead of simultaneously. And so again, on these 3 sort of strategies that we're implementing about learning, the cognitive theory, they have a lot of problem solving. So the students started with the idea of like, well, how can we really focus in on what's most critical in this project, right? And so they decided to target these at-risk subpopulations, such as the students who are in the lowest quartile in terms of GPA and the students who were taking longer than average to graduate. And they thought this is the most important because these are the people who really need these kinds of recommendations. And so how can we tailor our findings and our analysis to that sort of genre? And then the second is skills acquired. So they, of course, also did sort of like a set of known and unknown types of skills. So they obviously knew a lot about hypothesis testing, but maybe not so much about stuff like multiple testing correction. And so they were able to integrate all the things that they had learned before with this new knowledge. And additionally, of course, under the hood, there's a lot of data manipulation and data cleaning before you can even start running any of your modeling work. And then the last is statistical literacy. So they also had this client recommendation presentation at the end. And in addition, they also created a visual Shiny app more targeted towards students. And it was able to essentially take all of their findings and summarize them for anybody who would want to see based on the concerns that they looked at. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Sam then.
Hello, my name is Sam, if you don't know me, and I was the TA for the spring quarter semester of this consulting class. And in the spring quarter, this was where we had to do the very quick transition from the class being an in-person class to the class being a virtual class. So we were able to see sort of how things were able to shift over from the sort of previous environment to one that was mostly on Zoom, where the students were also facing a lot of hardships just due to the suddenness of the pandemic and all of the difficulties that caused. So one of the ways that we sort of restructured the course for the spring quarter in order to keep people motivated is that we made most of the projects about modeling the COVID-19 pandemic, as we thought the pandemic was on a lot of people's minds, and it's a very sort of relevant thing to sort of keep people engaged and working with the data that was sort of becoming more and more available as the situation was progressing. So what you see on this slide is a post from the UCLA news section on the stats website, where we highlighted two projects from this spring quarter consulting course that we thought were particularly exemplative of sort of what can be accomplished through this course, even in the virtual environment. So for the example that I'm going to be talking about on how we're still able to get sort of those 3 or 4 dimensions of the theoretical course framework to be expressed in the virtual version of this course, I'm going to be talking about the second project. So there are some links here, and this is just a presentation, but if you go on the stats website and you go to the news section and you find this blog post, then you can have access to both of these two links. One is a link to the dashboard that the students created as the final output of their project, and the other one is a video where they explain how to use the dashboard in a way that's accessible to a general audience. So for the first dimension of the course, yeah, I can go to the next slide. I'll talk about the sort of hard and soft skills that they developed, because this particular project that these students did required a lot of hard skills. So the project that they decided to do, sort of that they were thinking about at the beginning when people were formulating problems that had to do with the coronavirus epidemic, is they were interested in how we could model the effect of the timing of different stay-at-home interventions on the actual spread of the coronavirus that we could see through the data. So at the time, there was a lot of information coming out on sort of different stay-at-home orders and different restrictions that different states were coming up with. And what these students sort of thought about was, there is a sort of major aspect of this pandemic is that there are a lot of cases that are asymptomatic and a lot of cases that are symptomatic. And some of the asymptomatic cases, at least, especially during the early phases of the pandemic, and even now, were going unreported because people didn't have symptoms to know that they should be getting tested. So we had given a presentation from an expert about general disease modeling, but these students took that a little bit further and consulted the literature and asked us for recommendations in the literature about how to do a sort of more sophisticated model that took into account the fact that we had both asymptomatic and symptomatic cases. And what they wanted to do was use that in order to sort of test the theoretical or the effects of different interventions that were being imposed by different states on the spread of the virus. So they wanted to do simulations in order to do that test, because in the real world, we just have one observation, but using a model, you can test whether or not different sort of alterations of the interventions and the stay-at-home orders would have any effect. So the hard skills is that they had to learn about this SIRU modeling. So what that stands for is susceptible, infected, removed, and unreported. So that's just sort of the disease modeling that they had to learn about. So we taught a little bit about that, but they went even further at consulting the literature and learning about more technical aspects of this model. And they had to learn about the differential equations that are sort of involved in setting up this model and running simulations. And then they also had to learn about data visualization too, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. So for the soft skills, which is in the next slide. So this is hard to see, but if you do, after this, go to the news site and click on the link to the dashboard, this is sort of the dashboard that they created as their final project, which really shows how they were able to develop the soft skill of being able to express sort of the complicated models that they developed in a way that is very intuitive and very accessible to a general audience. So this is accompanied by a video that is also linked to on that blog post, where they give a good explanation for how to use this dashboard. And what you can do is you can click on different states and you can change your sort of theoretical intervention. And then you can compare the effect of the theoretical intervention on simulated data with sort of the actual observed data. And that allows you to sort of hypothesize of how different interventions actually worked from the perspective of this model. So of course, there are a lot of assumptions that are involved in sort of taking these results into account. So they probably shouldn't be interpreted too literally, but still for a team of undergrads, we thought this was a very impressive way of really showing sort of the power of models and the power of models to understanding the different choices that could have been made throughout this pandemic. So yeah, so the data presentation and the sort of video and the dashboard was all a part of the soft skills of conveying their information to the general public. Yeah, so for the next slide. So the cognitive theory sort of comes in that they did a really good job of integrating old knowledge and new knowledge. So we sort of taught them, or had an expert come in and talk to them about new sort of theories that they probably didn't know about before, that not many people outside of epidemiology were thinking about before, in terms of disease modeling and how scientists sort of understand how diseases are spread. And what they took from that is they integrated that with old knowledge that they had about statistical methods, in particular MCMC methods, for gauging the uncertainty in your simulations. And they were able to integrate that together in order to include statistical techniques into the disease modeling. And we think that was a really good sort of way of showing that in sort of this cognitive theory framework, where we encourage them to sort of come up with connections between different types of concepts and to sort of bring back old concepts and then refresh them, because they had to even further develop their knowledge of MCMC methods in order to be able to fit them to these disease models that they were using. And they were pretty successful at doing that. So what this chart shows, and this is one of the charts that you can see from the dashboard, is this is just the parameters of their theoretical model that they display. This is a little bit less intuitive if you're not familiar with the sort of previous research on SIRU modeling. But on the next slide, this is where they sort of show the results from that theoretical model that they do, where they integrate both old statistical concepts or statistical concepts that they were previously aware of with sort of the new knowledge that they were integrating into their project, through a visualization of their results that is much more intuitive to people who are sort of investigating their dashboard out of the general public. So this is explained more in their video, but just sort of a simple explanation of what this plot shows is that these vertical lines are when the intervention, the sort of stay-at-home intervention, occurred. On the left plot, it's in the real world. So they have that New York, so this is for the state of New York, that in New York, the stay-at-home sort of intervention occurred on March 21st. And then they sort of led up on the interventions on the second dotted line, which was in May. So that shows both the results of their theoretical model, the CR is the cumulative reported, and the black dots are the actual recorded data. And as you can see, those two lines seem to fit pretty well, which shows that they actually did do validation using their statistical methods to validate their model with the real world data. Then on the right-hand side is a theoretical simulated version where you delay the intervention, the original stay-at-home intervention, by 2 weeks. So that's an option that you have in the dashboard. And in this one, you can see that the CR, which is the cumulative reported cases, is much higher, which indicates that if under their theoretical model, if you had delayed the stay-at-home intervention, then you would have had a lot more cases overall than you actually see in the real data. So this is something that they had thought about at the beginning of the course. They had sort of formulated this hypothesis: how can we explore how the timing of the intervention affects the overall case levels? They took sort of the new information that we had sort of given them through guest speakers on disease modeling, integrated it with old information, and then were able to take all of that sort of technical knowledge that they developed themselves and express it in a way that is very sort of useful to and interesting to the general public. Of course, these results shouldn't be taken too literally, because disease modeling is very complicated, and they outline the various assumptions that they make for the validity of these models. But it's still sort of very good demonstration of how this consulting class is able to develop their statistical literacy, their ability to communicate, sort of their hard skills that they're motivated to by their own inquiry, and the cognitive theory dimension, where they're integrating old knowledge and new knowledge based off of sort of their own interests that they're pushing forward. Yeah, so then the next section is on the results, conclusions, and recommendations for future courses.
Okay, so I'll kind of take this back from Sam. Thank you very much to you both. Great job. So these are, I mentioned that I did some kind of Likert scaling, asking them questions about the 3 dimensions. And I'm not going to go through these questions, but I pay attention. I am an active participant. I feel comfortable asking questions or whatnot. So these are questions we asked pre-pandemic. These are some of the questions we asked post-pandemic. They're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. They're along the same line of theory. Then what I did, I collapsed there are very few disagree questions. Somewhat agree, these are all percentages, not that high. Then I combined strongly agree and agree responses for for this course pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And as you see, the responses are quite high, saying they either strongly agree or agree that we did reach the goals of the course, which in turn are based upon the theoretical model that we proposed at the beginning. Next slide. And so what you see here is that this is the result of everything. So you see here is that this is the cognitive dimension of the course. These are the hard soft skills. This is statistical literacy. And then here you see a mean and a range. These are the mean of the percentages of people who said, I agree and I strongly agree. And the range also gives you an idea about what's going on there. So you see all of these are above 72 and all the way they range till about 85 or something, which means, it seems that we did reach, based on students' perceptions, the goals of the course or the objective of the course that were designed were designed on the basis of the theoretical model. And right now, Steph and Sam did a great job of, making that clear exactly what we mean. Next slide, please. In this slide, you see the means of percentages. And as you see, these are necessarily not that different. We are actually maybe lying with statistics because these numbers are, the range is not that much from 72 to 84. It looks like a lot. Statistical literacy, so there are 3 classes we are looking at. The blue is the consulting course pre-pandemic. The yellow is the consulting course post-pandemic taught remotely. And the gray is the linear model taught post-pandemic. So we have 2 post-pandemic and 1 pre-pandemic course. As you see in the statistical literacy dimension, we're pretty close. But this is a little bit more, these numbers are a little bit lower than actually maybe the hard and soft skills. And that's because writing is hard, especially for students in our end of the campus. They don't practice writing that much. So they don't like that they have to write, but they have to write. If you notice that in the consulting course that was taught in person, the hard and soft skill is the highest. And that's pretty normal, because pretty natural, because they were working with a real client and they had a lot more back and forth, not as a group between themselves, but with a real person or a real group of people out there. Odd enough or interesting enough, you see that the cognitive dimension is higher for the 2 courses that were taught post-pandemic. And this one I can explain because in the linear model course and in the course based on COVID, there was not as much variety in the statistical, in the project. So it was more structured. And the knowledge they had to learn was more structured. And we actually had to create a lot more structure because it was online. So Sam and I attended every lecture. And we also, when I was talking, they have to report on milestone 1, milestone 2, and milestone 3. We were there all the way through the whole, time together. And I would go into Sam's sections. Sam would come into my lecture. And so we would put these groups into the room. Each group met with themselves. So let's say if group 1 was reporting on milestone 1, all the other students kept working in their groups. And I have found this technique very useful, because when you group them and you send them their way, then it's very hard for them to be able to actually find each other, find a time that works for everybody. So this was good. Then, you know, they had this opportunity to work together during section and during lecture. And that made the need for extended office hours even not as much. So this is an overall picture of what you see we found, you know, the quantitative aspect of it for the linear model. I mean, sorry, for the theoretical model on which we based our study. Next. This is Stephanie again.
Yeah, so in addition to the Likert scale-based evaluation questions, there were also these sort of free response questions. And one of those that was asked both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic for the consulting course was, if you wanted to explain the statistical consulting course in 5 words, what would they be? And so a student was able to take these evaluations and visualize them into these 2 word clouds. So you see on the left, the pre-COVID, and on the right, the post-COVID. And so the size of the word corresponds to the frequency of occurrence in those responses. And so you can see sort of some of the similarities and differences between these word clouds. They both seem to have this aspect of the course being a very like practical, real world kind of learning experience. And that is very much intentional in sort of the objectives and the structure of the course. But maybe some of the differences you might see are that the post-COVID word cloud really emphasizes soft skills in a way that you haven't seen as much in pre-COVID, which is actually maybe surprising, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on fun, teamwork, communication, flexible, creative. And those are things that don't show up quite as prominently in the pre-COVID. And it's surprising because even though you've moved everything onto Zoom and online, it seems like students are still really able to get those soft skills and get that sort of like team bonding experience out of the course. And I think that probably has to do with some of the changes that were made to adapt to online teaching and putting those like during lecture breakout rooms for the groups to work together. So the other type of analysis that was done on this same question for these same 2 courses was a sentiment analysis. So here, instead of just the word cloud, you have negative and positive words, or the connotations of the words being negative and positive. And the way you can read this is that the size of the word corresponds to the frequency given the connotation or the category, the sentiment category. And for both of these courses, pre and post pandemic, you can see that the biggest negative word is challenging. So maybe this is not really like a negative thing, but just that like overall people find this course to be in some ways challenging. But one of the differences on this negative connotation side is in the pre-COVID cases, you see a lot of more course content negative connotation, so like complex, mistakes, problematic sort of stuff. Whereas in the post-COVID, you see stress and burdensome, which seems to be more, I would say, like atmospheric or like outside of the particular content of the course and more in the way the course is approached. And then on the positive side, the pre-COVID has also still more like skill-based positive notes, like it was helpful and you gain skills valuable. Whereas the post-COVID emphasizes more of those like social soft skills. So fun, creative, and flexible. So it's just interesting to see like the differences and sort of similarities between the sentiments of the course. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you for these.
So these word clouds are comparing the statistical consulting course that we did in the spring and the linear models course that we did in the summer. So this is the same question as before, comparison of, the question is explain this class in 5 words. So we can see that in the linear models course in the summer, we were also able to get some similar things. A lot of the people described it as sort of an experience, projects. We also based that class as a project-based class. Data, learn, knowledge, skills. Fairly similar. Some things, I guess the linear models class was less fun than the project class because you don't see that word as large on the right-hand side. But we're generally able to get sort of similar sort of experience by making it based off of projects and keeping people engaged through sort of those meetings and that interaction and collaborative nature. And then in the next slide, we have the same comparison between the statistical consulting class in the spring on the left and the linear models class in the summer on the right. And we also show that with this sort of way where we have these projects and people are sort of engaged in learning, they also still found it challenging and hard, difficult, awkward, I guess, is on the right-hand side, because I guess it's just doing things with Zoom can always be a little bit awkward. But people also found it fun, engaging, knowledgeable, valuable, comprehensive, resourceful. So they were generally still having a good experience with that sort of project-based interactivity that we were able to construct over Zoom in the summer class as well as in the spring class.
Who's talking about this? Stephanie?
I think, is this one mine? I'll do this one. I forget. So we had some challenges in doing this this consulting class, especially since it got so popular. We've had apparently several years ago, it was only 6 to 7 students and it grew to over 100 over 10 years. So getting sort of the interactivity and sort of having students working together is sort of the key aspect that we find in doing this class with a large number of people. So for the virtual version of the class that I TA'd for, we had broken up people into sort of smaller groups that allowed them to interact with each other. For the spring quarter, we did not do actual clients because we had that sort of abrupt transition between the in-person version of the class in the winter and the virtual version in the spring. So we had them all working on COVID-related projects in the spring. But doing it this way, where we have sort of these small groups working on projects, they were all able to find a project and sort of come up with a hypothesis that interested and motivated them in order to keep them engaged and sort of working together in an active way. So some students, though, still sort of were lacking motivation in the spring due to the sort of abruptness of the pandemic. And we noticed from surveys that the pandemic was creating a lot of issues in people's personal lives. A lot of people have various different problems, whether it be economic or with sort of the technology aspect of being on Zoom or their living situation. And we had 67% say that they were lacking motivation. So that's why we sort of found that it was so critical to keep people engaged. So as opposed to a class where we just sort of have video recordings and then people just sort of watch them on their own and they're not necessarily going to be interacting with people over Zoom, we thought that sort of the interaction and keeping people motivated and engaged that way was really sort of a crucial way to remedy this lack of motivation that people are tending to experience in the pandemic.
Okay, so 2 of the other challenges of this course were, so first is having this sort of structured work time where everybody can meet together. It's sort of challenging in a group project with everything going on to make sure that everybody is working and doing what they should be in a regular, systematic way. And so the last half of the quarter, the actual lecture time is turned into project-based group meetings. And by doing that, we can both provide that structured group time where everybody should be available, as well as sort of help monitor the progress of students and really interact with them on an individual level and sort of in the moment of whatever current problem they're facing. And the second sort of challenge is sort of differences in skills and motivation coming in. So obviously not everybody's going to come in with the same background or with the same interests or motivations. And one of the ways we try and address this is through stuff like extra types of office hours. So when I was TAing the consulting course, I would hold scheduled group office hours where you could come in with your project group and specifically have like a 20-minute slot or something where we would just discuss with your group whatever current problems were going on with your like current status of the project. And that sort of allowed students who needed a little bit more reassurance or maybe a little bit more just like conversation one-on-one to get that whenever they needed.
I think that's me. So the conclusions that we want to draw is that we wanted to talk about the scholarly significance of this study. First of all, the study worked, I think, because it was based on a theoretical model of learning and teaching. And as you saw, all the traces that I was talking about, like getting students' attention, motivation, whatever, they all showed up in the word clouds that the students were Sam and Stephanie were showing you. So we see in these word clouds, as well as the quantitative findings reported, we see that students' comments are reflective of the 3 dimensions of the theoretical framework on which the course is based. And it's also interesting to see that, as I showed in that plot of the means, that findings from the assessment of the courses taught pre and post-pandemic are pretty similar to each other, and interesting enough, the same in the linear model course. And so basically what we showed you here is that it seems that this design could have the potential of successful implementation in teaching applied statistics via Zoom, and I think particularly in different disciplines, because context was one of the things that we were big on all quarter. All quarter, one important dimension was that students had to keep on reading articles, scientific articles. From like when we were doing COVID, they read so many articles from JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association. And I still think the key to one of the things that was also very worked really well was the collaboration between the instructors, because since we were there every step of the way, listening to what are you doing at milestone 1, what are you doing as milestone 2, what are your issues. So that was the best collaboration that I had with my TAs, because we constantly worked with group of students during class while others continued to work on it. And so that is pretty much our conclusion. And next slide, we would like to, offer our thanks to Dr. Daniel Rootman from the Julius Stein Eye Institute, Dr. Adam Sigano, the Director of Data Analytics, and Dr. Celia Zhang, the Assistant Director of Data Science at UCLA, for giving us the data and honestly spending invaluable time with our students. Those surgeons sometimes spend 3 hours with us in a meeting, and Adam, Dr. Sugano, and Dr. Zhang would actually come to our class and sit there for a whole 50 minutes and speak to students, explain the data to them, and so on. So none of this would have happened without, the collaboration from the clients and with the 2 amazing people I taught with. And so we thought, if we share our experience, it might other might find it useful. And we have detailed slides that we didn't show it all, but the presentation is, the write-up is a lot more detailed than we showed. We'll be happy to share or answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahtash and Stephanie and Samuel. So even though we cannot applaud for you, but I can send this reaction. Yeah, very informative and very nice. Especially, I think the examples you give about those projects, these are very useful for the students who want to take the consulting class in the future. So that's why I think probably we can share this video and point them to those examples so the future students can get a sense about what a consulting project is like before they actually.
Definitely, yeah.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And we have many of those projects on the 141SL CCLE website. And anybody who wants, we can give you access. You'll go in for each project, you see a folder. Inside the folder, you will see the clean data, you'll see the R codes, and the final report and the presentation. Yeah. And the same thing happened even in my diversity class. That's how I teach every class. Yeah. So if you have questions or you like to, ask us, or you want to.
If any of you have questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask. I think that would be more flexible. Maybe I can open up with one question, Mahtash. So for undergrad student, if a student is not very clear about the distinction between statistics and data science, how would you clarify it to him or her? Or
If
what?
someone asked me what's the difference between statistics and data science,
Right.
well, I think probably data science can go under the umbrella of statistics.
One way or the other.
Is really the way we saw it in the past. It's a combination of the knowledge of math as well as all the techniques you learn. Data science probably maybe is the more applied nature of it, but I still believe that you cannot do data science without math. Because all of these projects we talked about, they all had a math component that the students had to understand.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that we try to do in this consulting course that the students do not have the opportunity in other classes is, collaboration and working on projects and working together and working with the instructors.
Right.
And I think it's even doable on Zoom. And sometimes, we felt, Sam and I, felt that we didn't even have extra office hours. When we did office hours, nobody showed up because, we were meeting with every group so systematically, that we knew exactly where everybody was. The one challenge we had was that students hid themselves. So you're teaching a class of 40 or something and you wouldn't see faces. And I think that's a challenge. I never knew how to get over that one. But
I see.
But I think all in all, the students seem pretty happy with what happened. Yeah. Any other questions from? Well, I guess there are no more questions.
Maybe I can ask a second question. So how would you recommend to students who don't have much programming experience? So what do you think, how much do you think they should focus on gaining program experience before they can actually work on some concrete data analysis projects?
Right now, the 102 series is teaching them a lot of new programming, like Python and stuff that they didn't have before.
Right.
So I think the 102 series is really helpful, and the 101C course, in the series that has quite a bit of machine learning, brings them in with the skills. But to me, the most important thing, and that's what I was trying to explain with this cognitive theory, is learning how to learn. You know what I mean? So if they come with this, if they're confronted with something that they don't know, I think they have enough background information to be able to teach it to themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that is what we have been noticing that happens in these classes, that when you give them a new project and there's some stuff they don't know, they go learn it. But it's very hard to say exactly you know, how much of this skill or how much of that skill or how much of that skill, because it totally depends on the nature of the project that they end up working on.
Mm.
But I have seen them being able to go teach, self-teach themselves. But the other thing is that the other interesting thing is that we get a spectrum of variation with respect to students' abilities and students' background knowledge, you know, and all that. What's interesting is that if the project is kind of aligned with the student's background, their interest and level of sophistication, the important thing is for everybody to make everybody feel successful. You know what I mean? Like one student can feel successful and be in the top 10%, and another student can feel successful and be in the middle 50%. You know what I mean? But what has been fascinating is that in all these classes, all the students feel so good about their projects and about what they are doing, because they're learning something. You know what I mean? It's not all at the same level, but the long-term effect of it, which is on their attitudes and their self-confidence, and you know, they're making sure they, you know, can solve a problem and make something happen. That has always happened in the course, regardless of you know, the student's background and how much information they have, because as you know better, it's a pretty wide spectrum.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no more questions, let's thank the speakers again. And this is a very successful first seminar to kick the start of the quarter. So our next seminar will be on Tuesday, and yeah, then we'll be weekly. So see you next week then, and take care.
So much. Thanks to everybody
Thank you.
for listening. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for arranging this. Yeah.